When we talk about freedom, it's hard, it's not tangible, it's not a thing that we can easily discuss, but there is actually a method to do this developed by a behavioral scientist named Izzy Golddiamond. Welcome to the Daily BA and Degrees of Freedom. In 1971, B.F. Skinner wrote this book and published it called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, really putting a bad taste in people's mouth because he looked at it from a deterministic worldview and saying that our freedom is really this illusion. It's because our environment is controlling our behavior and influencing our behavior, and this gets in the way. We believe that we have freedom, but really it's the environment that's playing the role. And if we could come to terms with that, we could program our environment to make us feel free.
We take a specific example. Last evening, I went to the theater. Now, why? Well, I could tell you that I felt like going. It occurred to me, the idea of going to the theater occurred to me, and I went. I could also tell you that, looking at it from my professional point of view, that when I've gone to the theater in London, I've always been richly reinforced. That is to say, things have happened which have increased the likelihood that I will go to the theater when I'm in London. And this would be the explanation that I would give. And I would say that that explanation would also explain why the idea of going to the theater occurred to me and why I felt like going.
Now, while I agree with that sort of logic on a scientific sense of the deterministic worldview that we live in, that our behavior is influenced by a number of different factors, the environment, learning history, genetics, etc., the thing is that doesn't really give people a solution on how to move forward. Now, he talks about in his book, but there's another psychologist, Izzy Golddiamond, that had a fantastic way to describe this. And that was through this term that he calls degrees of freedom. I want to give an example first of this. Let's say that you go to your pantry and you have 5 different choices you could potentially choose from of what was going to be for dinner that night. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees of freedom, all right? 5 choices, 4 degrees of freedom. Say you only have 2 options in there. You've got leftovers, you're supposed to eat leftovers. You have 2 different choices, that is 1 degree of freedom. And this was a very easy, measurable way, tangible way to look at the number of choices people had and how much freedom potentially they could have in this sort of view and model of behavior, choice making, freedom, etc. The reason everyone is feeling so suppressed or weird right now during this pandemic and closure is because the reduced number of degrees of freedom. And this is a concept that I really wanted to nail home. The thing that I love most about degrees of freedom is it applies anywhere. You look at, I don't know, the number of options you have to go out and eat, to shop from, maybe the number of movies you have to choose from, the number of different schools you have that you can potentially apply to, get accepted to. If you can think of a situation in which you are choosing, there are degrees of freedom there and things you can look at. So now the question becomes of control. We talked about it, Skinner talked about the environment controls our behavior and how that can leave us with this weird sense of who we are and our free choice. But if you pitch this just a little bit different and you look at degrees of freedom, this is where we have a measurable way to look at how many options we have and we can advocate for this. So my example here, I want to bring in the deinstitutionalization movement of the 60s and 70s. There were some very inhumane, inappropriate, unethical things that were going on for people that were diagnosed with different disabilities, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and it resulted in this large push to be able to get rid of these mental institutions, behavioral institutions that we had. Often state-run, really poor quality services, and this needed to happen. Some sort of reform needed to happen. However, some places completely rid these options and they banned anything that kind of resembled them or certain forms that resembled them. And what happened as a result of that is the number of degrees of freedom that people had to be able to choose between services decreased, in a sense, reducing the freedom that people had in their day-to-day life. And this is kind of the key point here. When we're talking about what people need in a time of a pandemic or in a time of any sort of service like the deinstitutionalization movement, the key thing here is to not rid them, understand where they are useful, the parameters of them, and make sure that they are being advocated for when they are best needed. So a placement that resembles an institutionalization might actually be appropriate for some people. Maybe somebody's widowed, has no family, and this is the only place that they can get their services. The inhumane part of it was through a lot of procedural and issues that were going on systemically in that field. But the actual design, implementation, and how it could have been ran could have fit within an ethical framework. And the reason I really like this is because you can bring that control perspective back in there. Regardless of whether you like the word or not, if you look at the number of choices, the degrees of freedom that you have, you can then have a discussion around how to increase them and have more options for you. In a way, you are controlling for the amount of freedom that you feel. And that is the value of degrees of freedom and the thinking that Izzy Gold Diamond brought to this area of the philosophy and science of human behavior. How do we increase the range of our degrees of freedom? If you're a behavior nerd like me, I've linked down below a few of his different articles and books and his way of thinking espoused by others. Check them out, and thank you again for your time. That's your Daily BA.